I knew the game was over the moment. My son tossed a small wooden box into a garbage sack and called it junk, because inside that box were the architectural bones of my husband's mind, and a handwritten warning that our only child would one day try to bury me alive. Now I live in a 40-foot diesel pusher motorhome that was paid for with the money he stole from me, crisscrossing America while his name rots in a federal court docket and his wife's designer handbags sit in an evidence locker. My name is Catherine Hart. I was a registered nurse for 32 years in a cardiac step-down unit where I learned to read the silent language of monitors, the way a subtle change in a waveform meant the difference between a patient who walked out and one who coded at 3 a.m. I raised my son Daniel alone after my husband Frank died of pancreatic cancer when the boy was 12, and I worked the night shift exclusively so I could be home when the school bus dropped him off, even if it meant sleeping in 2-hour chunks for a decade. Frank was an architect who still drafted by hand on rolls of vellum when the rest of his firm had switched to CAD software. Every detail in his drawings was intentional, every load-bearing wall calculated, every room oriented to catch the winter sun at a specific angle. He built our daughterless life around a single paid-off condo on a quiet cul-de-sac, a 2-bedroom unit he designed himself with a courtyard fountain that he once told me would outlast all of us because he had mixed a slow-cure epoxy into the mortar joints. The fountain had a cherub statue holding a scallop shell, and water circulated through a hidden PVC loop that Frank had installed himself, swearing that as long as the pump ran, the water would never stop. He was the quiet architect of our family, and I was the nurse who held it together with coffee and overtime. After he died, I kept the condo exactly as he left it, right down to the model ship on the mantel and the black leather journal he tucked behind his drafting table. Daniel grew up, got a marketing degree from a state school I paid for with double shifts, married a woman named Melissa who wore crisp blazers and spoke in curated sentences that sounded like they'd been focus grouped, and I settled into an early retirement filled with gardening and book club meetings. Then at 54, my body decided to rip up the blueprints. On a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, while I was pulling Creeping Charlie from around Frank's fountain, a blood clot that had been hibernating in my carotid artery broke free and travelled into my brain. I remember the exact sequence because my nursing brain catalogued it even as it was happening. A sudden metallic taste flooding my mouth, a sensation like warm water running down the inside of my skull, and then the left side of my face went slack, as if the muscles had been unplugged from their nerves. I reached for the fountain's edge, but my left arm wouldn't obey, and the flagstone came up to meet me with a sound that I felt in my teeth. The paramedics later told me I had suffered a moderate ischemic stroke in the right middle cerebral artery territory. I spent 3 days in the neuro ICU with a TPA drip that burned going in, my speech reduced to a slurry of half-formed syllables, my left arm a dead weight, while monitors beeped a syncopated dirge. Daniel and Melissa arrived on the second day, all moist eyes and clasped hands. They huddled with the neurologist outside my door while I watched through the glass, my good hand clutching the bedrail. Daniel nodded solemnly, and I saw Melissa touch his elbow in what looked like a rehearsed gesture of concern. They came in and explained, with the careful cadence of people reading a script, how I would need round-the-clock care for months, how their house had a spare bedroom on the first floor that they had already cleared out, how I should never worry about being a burden because family takes care of family. Melissa smoothed my blanket and said, "We're going to bring you home, Kathy, just as soon as the doctors clear you." Daniel produced a thick manila folder stuffed with legal documents and a blue click pen. "We just need you to sign a few things, Mom, so we can talk to the doctors and handle your finances while you heal. It's standard, medical power of attorney, it's just a precaution." I remember the way he said precaution, drawling the word out as if it were a lullaby. I was too groggy to read the pages, but something in the back of my fogged mind, maybe 30 years of scanning patient charts for hidden medication conflicts and catching forged visitor logs, flickered. I told them I was too tired to hold a pen, my hand trembling for real. They left that night with the folder unsigned, and I was transferred the next morning to Golden Acres Convalescent Center, a county-funded facility that smelled of boiled green beans and a floral antiseptic that couldn't quite mask the ammonia underneath. Daniel said it was temporary rehabilitation, a stepping stone back to his house. He lied with a straight face and a kiss on my forehead. Within 10 days, I had regained enough coordination to sit in a wheelchair and feed myself applesauce with a trembling spoon. That was when they came to pack up my condo. Melissa announced they were just grabbing some photo albums and comfortable blankets for my room at their house, and they brought me along in the car for the fresh air, which I now understand was a tactical move to make me a witness to their care. I sat in my own living room, wrapped in a hospital blanket that still carried the industrial laundry smell of Golden Acres, watching them ransack my life. Melissa was in the kitchen, wrapping my copper-bottomed parts in newspaper and stacking them in a box labeled Kitchen Donate. She handled them with the clinical disinterest of someone inventorying an estate. Daniel opened the hall closet and started pulling out boxes of Frank's old architectural supplies, tubes of drafting ink that had dried solid, a set of French curves, and a small wooden case the size of a shoebox made of maple with brass hinges. I saw it and my heart lurched because I knew exactly what it was, a half-finished architectural model of a bungalow Frank had been tinkering with the year before he got sick, a passion project he called the Forever House. Daniel flipped the lid open, glanced at the miniature roof trusses and the tiny laser-cut window frames, and tossed it straight into a black garbage sack with a thud. Just Dad's old junk. Nobody wants that. Melissa looked over from the kitchen, a copper pot still in her hand, and nodded. We can donate the model supplies. Too much clutter, Kathy, you understand. I said nothing. I smiled the loose, slack smile of a stroke patient, the one that made people underestimate me and talk about me as if I were a piece of furniture. When they stepped into the garage to argue about the value of a lawn mower, I slid one hand under the hospital blanket, reached down and pulled the wooden box out of the garbage bag. It was heavier than it looked, the maple dense and cool. I tucked it under the blanket on my lap, wedged it between my thigh and the wheelchair arm, and it sat there, a hard rectangle of wood, all the way back to the facility, while Daniel and Melissa chattered about the traffic and the closing date on some recreational vehicle that they kept calling the rig. That night, under a thin carton sheet in a room I shared with a woman who moaned in her sleep, I used the edge of my plastic dinner spoon to pry open the box's false bottom. I had found it by accident an hour earlier when my thumb pressed a knot in the maple grain, and the entire floor of the box clicked upward on a hidden spring catch. Beneath it lay a black leather journal, the kind with a sewn binding and acid-free paper that Frank used for project notes. I recognized his architect's script on the first page, the neat all-caps lettering he used on blueprints, each letter precisely formed with a rapidograph pen. The pages were filled with sketches of that same bungalow elevation drawings of the front porch, calculations for foundation loads and window glazing, notes about passive solar orientation and thermal mass. It was like holding a piece of his mind. But on the final leaf, written in a slightly shaky hand that must have been his during those last weeks when the morphine fogged everything, was a message that stopped my damaged heart for a full beat. It read, "Kath, if you are reading this, I am gone and Daniel has likely pushed you aside. I have seen the dark threads in him since he was a boy, the small cruelties he learned to hide behind a charming smile. I built a fortress around you while I could still lift a pencil. Do not trust him and do not trust Melissa. Go to the fountain. The key is where the water never stops. Remember the scallop." I stared at those words until the ink blurred, and I felt a cold clarity settle over me like a sterile drape. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones sitting at your family dinner table, smiling and passing the salt. The next morning, Daniel and Melissa came back with new papers. They sat on either side of my bed, Melissa smoothing the blanket with short, impatient strokes, Daniel holding a click pen in his fist. "We need to get your affairs in order, Mom, so we can focus on your recovery," he said, all gentle practicality. The top sheet was a durable power of attorney, naming them as co-agents with full authority over my finances and healthcare decisions. Beneath it was a healthcare proxy that would let them override any treatment I refused, and beneath that, a quitclaim deed transferring the condo at 720 Juniper Lane to their names, for estate planning purposes. As Melissa put it, her voice a syrup. I squinted at the paperwork, my brain rapidly cataloguing the terms I had absorbed during Frank's end-of-life planning. A durable power of attorney meant they could liquidate my bank accounts, sell my car, and close out my retirement funds. A quitclaim deed would give them full ownership of my home, with zero legal protection for me. I could see, even through my post-stroke fog, that the document did not include any life estate clause, no right of occupancy, no provision that I could remain there. It was a gift deed, plain and simple, and the assessed value at the bottom of the page read $210,000. They were asking me to sign away a 6-figure tangible asset while I lay in a Medicaid bed, and they were calling it taking care of me. I also noticed the notary block already filled in with a name and commission number, as if they assumed I would just sign without question. I let my voice tremble and go soft. I just don't feel sharp enough yet, honey. Maybe next week after my therapy session. My head still feels so cloudy from the medication. I pretended to rub my temple and set the pen down on the nightstand. Melissa's smile tightened at the corners the way a mask cracks. Of course, Kathy, take your time. We're only trying to help. They left the papers on my nightstand, hoping I'd forget they were there. I did not forget. I memorized the routing number on the bottom of the quitclaim form, the name of the notary they had typed in, the assessed value, and the fact that the document referenced an escrow company called Vista Title and Trust. I began to plan my countermove while acting as weak and compliant as a rag doll. Over the following week they returned 3 more times. Each visit they brought a new set of papers, each version slightly revised, always with the same quitclaim deed. I parried every time with a new excuse: a headache, a therapy session that had exhausted me, a nurse who had just administered medication that made me groggy. I never signed a single line, and with each refusal I saw the mask slip a little more, a flash of real frustration in Melissa's eyes, a tightness in Daniel's jaw. Golden Acres was not a place designed for autonomy. The staff rotated every 12 hours, the hot water ran out by 7 a.m., and the lunch trays came with plastic sporks that snapped if you tried to eat anything denser than mashed potatoes. But it had one advantage. It gave me an unchallenged position from which to observe. Daniel and Melissa visited every Sunday at 2 o'clock, and their conversations were never about me. They thought I was dozing, the classic trick of an elderly patient, so they talked freely while I listened with my eyes closed, and my hearing attuned to every syllable. I learned about a big unit with a full-wall slide and a residential fridge and a diesel pusher chassis. I learned about a loan from a place called Triton Capital that had a closing date in 2 weeks and an interest rate that made Melissa wince when Daniel mentioned it. Melissa once said, quite distinctly while I lay with my face turned toward the wall, "The escrow officer called. They need a copy of your mom's driver's license for the notary verification," but I told them she lost it. Daniel laughed, that same hollow, edgy laugh he had used as a teenager when he'd been caught shoplifting candy bars. "Just send them a photo of the expired one, nobody checks. The notary we hired is a mobile guy, he doesn't care as long as the stamp goes on the paper." That was when I knew they had already listed the condo. They hadn't waited for my signature. They were actively forging my identity, and the deal was moving forward without me. Within the facility, I began a quiet campaign of information gathering. A week after I'd found Frank's journal, the bathroom in my shared room had a plumbing failure. A corroded elbow joint under the sink snapped, and rusty water sprayed across the linoleum in a geyser that hit the ceiling. The ward aide, a young man barely out of high school, stood frozen with his mouth open while the water crept toward the electrical outlets and the call light system. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, wincing at the residual weakness in my left side, and called over a nurse's aide named Carmen, who was running past with a mop. Carmen was in her early 40s, with tired eyes and a small silver crucifix around her neck, and she had been the only person to ever bring me a second carton of milk without being asked, the only one who addressed me by name instead of sweetie. "Carmen," I said, my voice still slightly nasal from the stroke, "go to the supply closet next to the medication room. On the top shelf behind the boxes of gloves, there's a red-handled lever. It's the main shut-off valve for this entire wing. Turn it all the way clockwise until it stops." She looked at me for a split second, then dropped the mop and ran. 20 seconds later, the water stopped. It turned out I had learned the location of every utility valve, electrical panel, and fire exit in the building during my first week, when I'd convinced a maintenance worker to let me read his facility schematic because I was bored out of my skull, and my nursing brain craved a map. That instinct had saved me in countless hospital emergencies, memorizing the crash cart locations and oxygen cutoffs. Carmen came back breathing hard, her scrubs soaked, and grinned. "You're a lifesaver, MS Heart, literally." I decided to trust her. Over the following days, I told Carmen my story in pieces during the quiet hour after dinner when the ward settled down. She listened without judgment, and she began to tell me about the facility's financial exploitation unit, a social worker named Diane who visited once a month and had helped other residents freeze assets, and about her own experience dealing with a shady nephew who tried to empty her late mother's bank account by forging a signature on a withdrawal slip. I asked her for a favor, small at first. "Next time my son visits, could you just notice what he carries, what kind of bag if he leaves anything in the car?" She agreed. The following Sunday at exactly 2:07 p.m., She reported back that Daniel had a brown leather folio tucked under his arm when he came in, and that he'd left his silver sedan unlocked in the visitor parking lot while Melissa went inside to use the restroom. Daniel was outside near the dumpster, pacing and arguing on his phone about a rate lock and a closing extension. Carmen slipped out the side delivery door, walked to the car with her gloved hands, and retrieved the folio from the passenger footwell. She wrapped it in a patient gown and brought it to me an hour later after they'd left, her hands shaking. Inside the folio, I found a treasure trove of evidence. There was a copy of the escrow instructions from Vista Title and Trust, referencing the sale of 720 Juniper Lane for $210,000 with a buyer named Peterson. There was a grant deed, stamped with the county recorder's seal, showing the property transferred from Catherine Hart to Daniel and Melissa Hart, signed by Catherine Hart, in an awkward, hesitant cursive that looked nothing like my real signature. The loops were wrong, the slant was off, and the K was formed with a downward stroke that I never used. And there was a promissory note from Triton Capital, a hard money lender, showing a $50,000 loan secured against the condo at 18% interest, also bearing a forged signature, dated 2 days after my stroke. They had taken out a predatory loan on my home before selling it, probably to generate a cash down payment for the RV, and they were using the sale proceeds to pay off the loan and pocket the equity. I used the cheap burner phone Carmen had smuggled in, a prepaid flip device hidden in her locker behind a box of sterile gauze, to take 23 photographs of every page, including the notary stamp with its commission number, the lender's routing number, the escrow officer's name and phone extension. I had proof of forgery, proof of elder financial abuse, and a paper trail that led straight to a closing date that was 4 days away. That same night, I reread Frank's journal entry. The note about the fountain had included a small diagram on the facing page, a cross-section of the stone base drawn in his precise hand. Frank had indicated that a waterproof PVC tube was inserted into a hollow cavity behind the cherub statue's left foot, accessible only if you knew to push a decorative scallop on the shell that was actually a spring-loaded catch. The tube contained a safe deposit box key, and it could only be retrieved if you reached underwater while the pump was running. I explained this to Carmen during her next shift, drawing a map on a paper napkin with a stub of pencil. Carmen lived in a small apartment only 3 blocks from my old condo, and the property was vacant, the lockbox still on the front door, but the garden was accessible via a side gate that hadn't been locked since 2003. 2 nights later, Carmen visited me at midnight during a laundry shift and handed me a plastic sandwich bag that was still damp. Inside was a brass safe deposit box key, engraved with the number 144 and the name First Mutual Bank. She told me, her voice low. I had to feel around under the water for about 5 minutes. The catch was hidden behind a little shell decoration that looked solid, but when I pressed it I heard a click and a tube slid out. Your Frank really did think of everything. I held that key in my good hand and felt the weight of it, cold and precise. I now had the key, the photographs of forged documents, and a fragile alliance with a nurse's aid. The next step was to activate the dead man switch my husband had built into our financial life. Using the facility's payphone during recreation hour the following morning, I dialed the number for First Mutual Bank's main branch and asked to speak with the compliance officer. A woman named Elena Vasquez picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice calm and professional, the kind of voice that had spent years de-escalating angry customers. I identified myself as Catherine Hart, gave her my social security number and date of birth, and said, "I believe there has been a fraudulent conveyance of a property held in trust at your bank. I am the beneficiary, and I am in possession of safe deposit box key number 144 issued to Frank Hart. I need to know if there is a trust on file." There was a long pause, the sound of typing, and then Elena's voice dropped. She told me that Frank had created an irrevocable trust, the Hart Living Trust, 8 years before his death, and transferred the condo at 720 Juniper Lane into it, with himself and me as co-trustees. Upon his death, I became the sole trustee, and the trust's terms required that any sale or transfer of the property be executed with a specific document called a trustee's certificate of identity, notarized in person at First Mutual Bank, with the bank's own notary witnessing my signature and matching it against a signature card on file. The trust also contained a spendthrift clause that prevented any beneficiary from assigning, encumbering, or alienating the property to a third party without the bank's written approval. The sale that Vista Title had processed used a mobile notary, and the signature on the grant deed did not match the bank's exemplars. Elena also told me that the escrow disbursement was scheduled for 3 days from now, But the moment she flagged the file, she could place an administrative hold on the funds pending a fraud investigation. I gave her Carmen's burner phone number as a callback, and within an hour, Elena called back to confirm the freeze was in place. She had also contacted the escrow officer at Vista Title and instructed them to halt all disbursements. Elena then connected me with Marcus Webb, a bank fraud investigator who specialized in elder exploitation cases. Marcus was a retired police detective with a quiet, smoker's voice and a habit of asking short, direct questions. I explained the forged signature, the loan, the RV purchase. He asked me to mail him printed copies of the photographs, and Carmen helped me print them at a FedEx office during her day off, then sent them via certified mail from a post office box. Marcus also referred me to Susan Kim, an attorney with a legal aid clinic that focused on conservatorship abuse and elder financial fraud. Susan came to the facility on a Thursday afternoon, wearing a creased blazer and carrying a battered laptop case. She sat in a plastic chair next to my bed, and I handed her the stack of photographs, the bank's affidavit from Elena, and a written statement Carmen had typed up describing how she had retrieved the folio and the key. Susan listened, took notes, and then explained the legal strategy. She would file an emergency petition for temporary conservatorship of my estate, alleging that Daniel and Melissa had obtained control through fraud and were actively dissipating my assets. The petition would seek to invalidate the forged quitclaim deed, freeze all my accounts, and issue a show cause order requiring my son and his wife to appear in probate court within 10 days. She also added a count under the state's Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act, which allows for treble damages, attorney's fees, and punitive damages if the exploitation is proven. I signed the retainer with my left hand, awkward but legible, and Susan left with a promise to file the papers the next morning. During all of this, I still had to play the invalid. Daniel and Melissa sensed something was off because their escrow officer had suddenly stopped returning calls, and their loan officer at Triton Capital was demanding an updated closing date. They came to Golden Acres on a Thursday, both of them radiating a brittle, impatient energy that filled the room like static. Daniel held a new document, an affidavit of competency that he wanted me to sign, claiming I was fully aware and freely granting them control of my affairs. "It's just to clear up a misunderstanding at the bank, Mom," he said, his voice strained and his knuckles white around a pen. Melissa stood by the window, tapping her foot on the linoleum, wearing new gold hoop earrings that caught the fluorescent light and a bracelet I'd never seen before. Her nails were freshly done in a shellac that couldn't have been cheap. I noticed these details with the cold clarity of a diagnostician. I decided to test them, to push past any lingering denial I still carried about my own flesh and blood. I planned a fake medical crisis. While Daniel was explaining that a mobile notary would arrive in 30 minutes and I just needed to sign, I let my eyes roll back, gurgled softly from the back of my throat, and then slid sideways off the bed, hitting the linoleum with a sound like a sack of potatoes. I lay motionless, my breathing shallow and ragged, my good arm twisted under me. For a long, cruel moment no one moved. Then I heard Melissa's whisper, high and thin, "Oh my God, is she?" Daniel cut her off. "Forget this, grab the affidavit." I felt his fingers pry the unsigned paper from my limp hand, felt the prickle of his wedding ring against my knuckles. He stepped back and his footsteps retreated toward the door. Melissa said, "Should we call the aide? There's a button." Daniel snapped, "No, calls get recorded. Just let someone find her. We need to get to the bank before the freeze goes through." The loan officer said if we don't close today, the RV seller walks. Their footsteps receded, the door clicked shut, and I lay there on the cold linoleum for 2 full minutes, letting the chill seep into my bones through the thin gown. I could hear the faint hiss of the oxygen concentrator in the next room, the distant clatter of a lunch cart. Then I opened my eyes, pulled myself up using the bedrail, and sat trembling with a rage so pure it felt like a second heartbeat. Any last filament of maternal love I had for Daniel was severed in that silent room. He had stepped over my dying body to grab a piece of paper. He had listened to me gurgle, and had calculated the value of a notary stamp. The probate hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Susan had arranged for me to appear in person, and Carmen drove me in her beat-up Toyota Corolla, my wheelchair folded in the trunk, and my best cardigan buttoned unevenly over my gown. I gripped Frank's journal in my purse, the key still in its plastic bag. The courthouse was a modern glass box, and I was wheeled into a hallway where Daniel and Melissa were already waiting with a hired lawyer, a man in a pinstriped suit who smelled of sandalwood and aggressive billing. Daniel saw me and his face twisted into a mask of false contrition that I recognized from his teenage years, the same expression he'd worn when a principal called about a forged absence note. "Mom, this has all got out of hand. Let's just sign a settlement and go home. Nobody needs to get the courts involved." He thrust a document at me, a full release of all claims and a waiver of liability, with a clause stating they would generously pay me $20,000 for my trouble from the condo proceeds, minus their legal fees. I looked at him, this stranger who had grown inside my body and drawn breath through my lungs, and I saw the dark threads Frank had warned about, woven into the fabric of his smile. I took the pen from his hand, looked at it and set it down on my lap. "You should have read your father's fine print," I said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the hallway hum like a scalpel. At that moment, the double doors at the end of the hall swung open. Elena Vasquez from the bank walked in, flanked by Marcus Webb, both wearing visitor badges. Behind them came two uniformed sheriff's deputies with their hands resting on their duty belts. Marcus stepped forward, holding a manila envelope stamped with the bank's seal and the words "Fraud Investigation Evidence." "Daniel Hart, Melissa Hart, you're under arrest for felony elder abuse, forgery, perjury, and grand theft. You have the right to remain silent." Their attorney started sputtering about procedural violations and rushed service, but the deputies were already folding Daniel's arms behind his back, the handcuffs clicking shut with a sound that echoed off the terrazzo floor. Melissa let out a thin, high shriek that made a bailiff look up, and her gold earrings caught the fluorescent light as she twisted away. Daniel looked at me, his face collapsing into something raw and ugly. "You crazy old woman, I was just trying to protect you." I didn't answer. I watched them both, my son and his image-obsessed wife, be led down the corridor in handcuffs, their lawyer trailing behind them, already dialing a bondsman. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, reviewed the evidence Susan presented in a methodical stack. The forged quitclaim deed with its mismatched signature, the loan documents showing the $50,000 hard money loan with an 18% interest rate, the proceeds of which had been transferred to an RV dealership 5 days before my stroke. The escrow instructions, the photographs of my genuine signature from the bank's exemplar card versus the forgeries, blown up on an overhead projector so the discrepancies were visible to everyone in the gallery. Elena Vasquez testified that the trust's requirements had been completely bypassed, that the bank had no record of a trustee's certificate, and that the mobile notary's logbook, which she had subpoenaed, contained an entry for a Catherine Hart notarization at a date and time when I was in the neuro ICU, intubated and unconscious. Marcus Webb testified that the fraud investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar schemes involving Triton Capital's loan officer, who was now cooperating with the district attorney. Carmen bravely took the stand and described, in a voice that only shook a little, how she had retrieved the folio from Daniel's unlocked car and the key from the fountain. She identified the photographs on the burner phone. I answered a few simple questions from Susan, my voice still halting but clear enough to state my name, and confirmed that the signature on the quitclaim deed was not mine. After 40 minutes, the judge removed her glasses and banged the gavel. She granted Susan's petition for full restoration of my estate, appointed a neutral temporary conservator until I was medically cleared, and issued a $250,000 civil judgment against Daniel and Melissa, comprising actual damages of $210,000 plus punitive damages, treble damages under the Elder Abuse Act, and attorney's fees. The sale of the condo was voided retroactively, though by then it had already closed and the buyer, Mr. Peterson, was an innocent third party. The court ordered that the escrow funds, which had been frozen, be returned to me, and since the title company's errors and omissions insurance covered the fraudulent conveyance, I received the full $210,000 back. And the RV that deluxe motorhome purchased with $180,000 of my stolen equity was seized as an instrumentality of the crime and awarded to me as partial restitution. The judge looked at me over her glasses and said, "Mrs. Hart, you may keep the vehicle or sell it. It is now your property." I chose to keep it. The weeks that followed were a slow grind of paperwork and physical therapy. Carmen helped me move into a small temporary apartment near the facility while the legal dust settled, and she remains my dearest friend to this day, the one person outside these walls who calls me Catherine instead of a case number. I attended Daniel's criminal trial, sitting in the back row in my wheelchair, and I watched him be convicted on 3 counts of forgery and 1 count of felony elder abuse. His defense attorney tried to argue that I had given verbal consent, that it was all a misunderstanding, but the jury saw the photocopies of my genuine signature and the forged one projected side by side, and they came back in 2 hours. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, Melissa to 2 years for conspiracy and perjury, though she served 18 months. Their assets were liquidated, their professional reputations annihilated, and their names appeared in local news articles with headlines like, "Couple sentenced in elder exploitation scheme." I felt no satisfaction, only a bone-deep exhaustion and a flicker of fierce pride for Frank. I took possession of the motorhome on a crisp October morning. It was a 40-foot Tiffin Allegro bus diesel pusher, with 4 slide-outs, a residential refrigerator, a washer-dryer combo, a king-size bed in the back, and a full-wall entertainment center that still had the plastic film on the screen. The interior smelled of new leather and Melissa's heavy floral perfume, which I spent 3 days airing out with every window open. I stripped the linens and donated them to a women's shelter, threw away the monogram towels, and deep-cleaned every surface until the ghost of her was gone. Then I added grab bars in the bathroom, a fold-down ramp at the entrance, and a satellite internet dish on the roof so I could stay connected from anywhere. I named the rig Frank's Farley, painted the name on the back in navy blue script, and moved into it full-time. I sold the condo to a young couple with a baby on the way, using the proceeds along with the civil judgment to fund a retirement account that spins off enough to cover fuel, campsite fees, and a slice of pumpkin pie at every roadside diner I encounter. I also accessed the safe deposit box, which contained Frank's original trust documents, a paid-up life insurance policy that he had designated to pay directly into a supplemental trust he created solely for me, inaccessible to any conservator or creditor, and a letter in his handwriting, the last page dated 3 days before he died. It read, "Live loudly, Kath. The fountain will keep running, but you need to move." I framed that letter and hung it above the driver's seat. Now I am living loudly. I drive Frank's Farley to national parks, parking it beside canyon rims in Utah and ocean bluffs in Oregon. My blog, Golden Years Reclaimed, gets 40,000 readers a month, and I detail every campsite every starlit evening, every senior resource hotline I wish I'd known about sooner. In my very first post, I uploaded a picture of Frank's journal, open to that warning page, held in my hand with the Grand Canyon in the background, the key resting on the page. I never used Daniel's name. In my writing, he is simply the perpetrator, and Melissa is the accomplice. Their names have been permanently redacted from my public life, though the court records are public and easily searchable if anyone wants to verify the details. The greatest inheritance Frank left me wasn't a condo or a key. It was the foresight to build a fortress of legal safeguards while he was still strong enough to lift a pencil, and the courage to leave me a map when he couldn't be there himself. You cannot always trust the blood that shares your table. You can only trust the planning that protects your future and the friends who help you find your way back to the fountain. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more tales of resilience and justice, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, stay sharp and protect your legacy.